Let's sew gorgeous linen dress for this summer. In this tutorial, you will learn how to sew facing, sleeveless armhole finish, how to do hemming with horse braid, and a few more valuable techniques. Hi, my name is Julie and welcome to my channel where we talk everything sewing. Today I want to show you how to make a perfect linen dress for the summer season. This video is packed with a lot of valuable information and you will be able to apply these techniques in other projects as well. To sew this dress, you will need my lily dress pattern, but instead of the ruffle details at the bottom, we will add it as the neckline and create beautiful bow tie neckline. The pattern is linked in the description box, and let's get started. So we will start assembling our dress from the main body of the dress. Here I have both pieces front right sides together and I pin at the shoulders and at the sides. And now I will simply go ahead and sew everything I pinned using a straight stitch. When sewing these kind of seams, always remember to make a few back stitches to secure the seam so that it does not fall apart when you sew later on. You may notice that I'm using a magnet. I like to add the magnet as my guide when I'm sewing, and it just helps navigate the fabric and I don't have to think a lot about where the seam allowance has to go. The magnet is helping me do that. So at the end of the seam, I will go ahead, sew till the end of the seam, make a few back stitches, a few front stitches, and cut the thread so that I have a secure, nice seam, and I will do all shoulders and sides the same way. So now we will finish the raw edges of the side seams. So here I have the side seam like this, right? I will open it and I have one layer of the seam. I will fold this edge like this and put it under my presser foot. Now I will be sewing 1 millimeter from that folded edge. Again, I'm working here with only one layer of the seam allowance. So I keep folding the seam allowance and sewing 1 millimeter from the edge. So here is how the finished seam allowance looks. When we will press the seam open, it will be pressed like this. All we will see is this seam right here, and the threads won't be fraying because they are secure. Now you can notice that it's a little bit wavy. Don't worry about it. We will press it and smooth it out. It happens because the side of our seam is cut on angle. So now I want you to go ahead and finish the next seam allowance the same way. You will going to fold and sew 1 millimeter from the edge. This is a very beautiful finish and it's a great alternative for serger or zigzag when working with woven fabrics. I love it because it just looks way classier and way more timeless than let's say serger or overlocker or zigzag, but at the same time it's rather easy to make and it's way easier than French seam. So just go ahead and finish the other side of seam allowance the same way, just folding and sewing 1 millimeter from the edge. Next, after you've done this, finish the other side as well, exactly the same way. You don't have to finish the raw seam allowances on the shoulders because when our dress, blouse, shirt has facing or lining, you don't have to secure the raw edges of seam allowance at the shoulders, because the lining or the facing will protect those parts from fraying. So here is how the pressed finished seam allowance looks like. It looks gorgeous, beautiful. Here you can see the folded raw edge, but when it's pressed and open, all you can see are these two rows. And from the outside of the garment, we get this really flat, nice seam finish. So you want to finish both sides of the dress the same way, and you want to keep the shoulder seams raw because we will be adding facing. So for this next part, I already prepared my facing. It has fusible interfacing, and I put both facing details right sides together so that the shoulders and the sides, and finished the raw edge of the bottom using a serger. I pressed every seam open and I have everything nice and flat, and I also marked the opening at the back piece from the inside of the garment. So in this next step we will do the back opening. So my dress is wrong side facing out, and I marked at the back piece from the inside of the garment, I marked the opening line and I put fusible interfacing. Here you can see how I put the fusible interfacing to cover fully the end of the opening. Because we will be cutting through the opening, the interfacing will protect the fabric from falling out. So the next thing is I take my my facing, and it's now facing right side out, and I will just go ahead and put it to the inside of the garment. I will align the facing and the main body of the dress at the shoulder seams. So at the shoulder seams, I will just put the needle, the pin, right through those seam connections. This way we will have nicely joined seam lines at the shoulder, and I will do the same with the other shoulder. So here we have our shoulders lined, and now it's time to line the marking. So I base stitch the opening of the main body of the dress and the facing together. This will allow me to sew a little bit easier and to get better access. So now I will just turn the dress to the other side. So here I will have more access to the opening sewing from this side. So here is the main body of the dress, right? So when you're sewing with fabrics like lining, they are moving so much. It's very good idea to secure with a few base stitches. So okay, now what we will do, we will sew 2 or 3 millimeters from this side of the base stitch, and we will sew all the way down to that bottom of the opening. So I make a few back stitches to secure the seam, and I'm sewing 2-3 millimeters parallel to this line. So now that I'm approaching the bottom, here you can see I mark my bottom. I will switch to the more narrow stitch because it will allow me to have a bit more accuracy, and I will slightly navigate my seam so that it ends right here. So I'm kind of creating that a half of V shape here. So I have reached that bottom of the opening, and with the needle pull down, let me zoom in and just show you better. Okay, so with the needle pull down, I want you to lift the presser foot, rotate the fabric like this, and now we will sew a few centimeters up, slightly forming that V shape at the bottom. So from this side you were sewing and doing that V shape, right? So now we will continue doing this from that other side of the opening. like this. So now I will restore my standard sewing stitch length, which is 3 millimeters, and I will continue sewing from this base stitch line to 3 millimeters, same way we did from the other side. Beautiful. Okay, so now I want you to go ahead and just remove that base stitch. We won't need it anymore. So here you can see how the opening looks like. We have this beautiful V shape at the bottom of the opening. Now the most scary part, I'm always afraid of this part, is to cut through the opening all the way till the end. So to do this, I'm using my very small, very sharp scissors, and I'm just go ahead and cut through the middle of those both seams. Now at the bottom, it really gets tricky. This is why we put interfacing, right? So I want you to go ahead and continue cutting all way down. You want to cut as close to the seam as possible without actually damaging it. So it will look something like this. So now when you turn the opening to the right side of the garment, you will have this stunning, beautiful shape. And I want you to go ahead and press it. And when you're pressing, so this is the main fabric of the dress and this is the facing, right? So I want you to go ahead and press so that from the right side of the garment, the facing is not visible. Let me press and return to you so I will show you how it looks. So pressed opening will look like this, and just look how beautiful that bottom is. It should look very sharp and just really gorgeous. I love this technique because it just gives beautiful finish that is not bulky and yet the facing is not peeking to the outside of the garment. So for the armhole finish, we will do the finish that has no visible seams on the outside of the garment. So I want you to keep the armhole bottoms, the facing and the dress together like this. So the right side of the dress is facing me and I'm holding those two seams at the bottom like this. Now I will put my hand to the inside of the dress, and now I want you to pay very close attention at what I'm doing. So now those seams will look like this, and I will just grab them together like this and pull the dress to the outside facing out. So now I will put a pin right through the bottom of the armhole to match both of those seams together like this. Now this second part will be a little bit confusing, so you will have to bear with me. So now I want you to go ahead and do base stitch, securing the facing and the armhole together. And you want to base stitch all the way up till you meet the shoulder. So once I'm gearing towards the shoulder, I will just go ahead and match the shoulder seams using the pin, so that later when I finish the dress, those seams will look matched and will be beautifully aligned. Here. So here we have the base stitch right till the shoulder. So now I want you to secure that base stitch and cut the thread. So this is what we have so far. So now let's return to the bottom of the armhole, and now we will be base stitching from the other side of the armhole all the way to the shoulder. So right now your armhole should be looking like this. Here you have some kind of a mess, right? It's very difficult to understand anything, but I promise you we will make sense out of this very, very soon. So we will start sewing from the shoulder line. So I will be sewing from the right side of the from the wrong side of the dress, starting from the shoulder line at the top. Right here is the shoulder line, and I will be sewing 1 centimeter around the armhole because that's our seam allowance in this part. So we sew all around the armhole. So now I want you to go ahead and remove the base stitch. So in this next step, I want you to do the under stitching. So the under stitching will help keep the facing in the inside of the garment and protect it from rolling to the outside of the garment. So how to do the under stitching? So here we have the facing and the main body of the dress. Here are the shoulder lines, right? So this is the armhole that we just did. So I want you to go ahead and push all seam allowance towards the facing. And we will start sewing from the top shoulder line 1 millimeter from the seam connection line. So this is how it will look. Let me just zoom in for you. So here we have the facing and the seam allowance. Here you can see that all seam allowance, both layers of seam allowance, are pushed to this side. And here I have the main body of the dress. Here I have the shoulders, and this is the armhole line that we just made. So I will be stitching 1 millimeter from this line all around the armhole. So when I'm sewing this part, I'm making sure that the seam does not roll like this or something like that. So I'm gently, very gently, just opening it and sewing. So here I went almost all the way around. Here you can see that I already start the seam here. So I will make sure to navigate the seam to end exactly at the same place. And I will cut the thread. The very last step that we'll have to do in this point, let me just zoom out. So the very last point that I want you to do in this particular step is to just trim that seam allowance, because right now the whole seam allowance is preventing the armhole from creating the beautiful curve. So I'm going to trim seam allowance very generously. And here you can see that this is my top stitching line right here, and I'm cutting like a few millimeter or two away from that line. So when you have the under stitching, it already protects the seam from falling apart. So don't worry, having a smaller seam allowance in this particular place is really no big deal. It will allow us to create the beautiful shape and the curvage of the armhole. And just cut all around the armhole. So when we trim the seam allowance, there is no problem for the armhole to curve beautifully. So I want you to go ahead and just press it, and when you're pressing, you want to make sure that the seam looks like this, so that the seam connection is pushed a little bit towards the inside of the garment and towards the facing. So I want you to go ahead and finish the second armhole exactly the same way, and I will do that and I will show you how both pressed armholes look. So this is how the pressed finish armhole looks. It's very, very beautiful. There are no seams visible to the eye outside of the garment, but it holds the shape so beautiful. And thanks to that understitching that we did here, right, the facing is not facing and is not pushing towards the outside of the garment. So this is really a beautiful finish, and you can finish all of the armholes when it has lining or facing doing this way. It's really beautiful, not bulky at all, and I just love how it looks. So now I have the bias tape. I made it from the same fabric. It's perfect when you need to match it neatly with your item, or you can create it from scrap fabrics that you have. That's perfect. So at the bottom, what we will do, we have our dress right side facing out, and I will add the bias tape like this. So I will align it with the edge and I will sew right at that fold line. So what I will be also doing in this step, I will position the beginning of the bias tape slightly above the beginning, above this seam, because I just don't want a lot of seam connections going at the same place. And I will start sewing a few centimeters from the bias tape start, because I will connect the end of it later on. So here is how it's going to look. So I'm now positioning the bias tape to place like this. And I will go ahead and start the seam, a few back stitches to secure it. And I will start sewing. I will align the bias tape edge with the bottom of the dress edge, and I will sew right on that fold. So because the bias tape is cut on bias and it's really elastic and flexible, so it will hug that curve of the hem so beautifully. So I will do it until I reach the bias tape beginning from the other side. So now that I'm approaching the end, I will make sure that when I unfold the seam, you can see where it started. So I will make sure that my seam ends perfectly there. So like this. So now we have this tape that we need to trim down. So one side of the tape is cut on angle like this, so we will need to cut the other one to the opposite direction, also at the same angle. So like this. So now I will put them together and just connect. So this is how you would like to press it in this space. So the second thing that I will do is I will go ahead and I will do the understitching, so that again my bias tape is not peeking to the outside of the dress. So we will do it just like this. The bias tape and all seam allowance is pushed towards this side, and I will be sewing 1 millimeter from the edge. And just go around all the hem, repeating the same stitch. So now that I've done the understitching, I will go ahead and just trim that seam allowance, because we don't need it this much, and with reduced seam allowance the hem will simply fold more beautifully and have more curvage. So I'll just go ahead and cut the seam allowance like this. So now I've trimmed the seam allowance, and I will take the horse braid that looks like this. It's very elastic. You see when I pull it, it just really narrows down. So what I will do next, I will take it and I put the edge so that it's covered with the bias tape edge like this, and I will slightly pull it and fold it like this, so it's fully covered with the bias tape. So I will start doing the top stitching, securing the hem in place. I will start doing it at one of the side seams. And when I will be sewing, I will make sure that I'm aligning the horse braid to go right under that fold of the bias tape. So this stitch is the top stitching, meaning this seam will be visible from the outside. So you want to start the seam with long threads, but you don't want to do the back stitches. So just go ahead and sew. And later when you finish the seam, you will bring back the thread ends to the inside of the garment and finish the seam this way. I will show you in a moment, but now let's focus on putting that horse braid into its position, folding and sewing. So I wanted to zoom in and show you what I'm doing here. So the horse braid is put into the bias tape here, and I'm doing the top stitching 1 millimeter from the edge. Also, this is the understitch that we did earlier, and this is the folded hem. So I'm just going ahead and stitching like this, and I will do this all around the hem. So now that I'm approaching the beginning of my seam, I will just go ahead and trim the horse braid. I will put it into the seam and then continue to sew until the end. So whenever you're working with a horse braid, the #1 rule to remember is to always cover it, because it's really stiff and it will otherwise hurt your skin. It will be just piercing. So I'm knitting the beginning of my seam. And as you remember, I said we are doing top stitching, so we are not doing back stitches, and we will finish the seam in a different way. So to finish the seam, just take the loose threads, put them in the hand needle and pull them to the inside of the garment, where you will secure the seam with a few hand back stitches. This way you will have a neater seam finish, and the beginning of the seam will be invisible. So you always want to do this when you're doing top stitching. So here is how the installed horse braid looks. From the inside of the garment, it's fully covered, and from the outside of the garment, you can see only one seam, and this gives to the hem a bit more structure, and the fall of the hem will look completely different than without this tape. So now I joined both ruffle pieces with the seam and pressed the seam open. So next, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my neckline. I marked the center with the pin, and I also aligned the shoulders of the facing together with the shoulders of the main body of the dress, just so it's easier for me to navigate the fabric. So at the center of the seam, at the center of the front detail, I will place this detail, and I will pin. And I will continue to pin all around the neckline until the opening. So when I have the ruffle details, previous ruffle details, now it's the neckline detail, I pin them from the opening all around the neckline to the other opening. So now I will go ahead and sew 1 centimeter from the edge, because that's the seam allowance that we have on our neckline. And I will start at one opening, and I will sew around the neckline till another opening. So here you can see that our ruffle is attached to the neckline, right? So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to trim down a little bit that neckline, just a little bit, maybe in half. It will give me better curvage, but since we didn't do understitching, I don't want to go all the way till the seam. So just trimming it in half. And you can see when I'm approaching towards the opening, I'm just raising it, and I'm not clipping at the opening. So this next part is we are going to sew our bow, and we are going to sew it like this. So here is the raw edge. As you can see here, we have that ruffle attached to the neckline, and so I'm going to fold the ruffle like this. And now I'm going to sew. So I'm going to sew like this. I'm starting at the folded top, making a few back stitches. With the needle pulled down, I'm going to rotate the ruffle detail, the bow detail, and just now I'm going to sew along the long edge until the neckline. So now I'm approaching the opening line that you see here, right? So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to position it like this, and I will continue to sew straight on that first line. Now remember that we trimmed already seam allowance, so we have to be overlapping them a little bit, like how much we trimmed should be overlapping. And we are sewing right on that first seam. Let me just zoom in and show you up close. So here is that first neckline seam, and I'm going to sew. Here is the overlap. And I'm going to sew how long I can reach, because I won't be able to reach all the way. So okay, it starts to get very uncomfortable, so I will just do a few back stitches and secure it like this. So now I'm going to trim the corners diagonally of that edge, and I will do the same with the other bow piece, bow side. So now I'm doing the bow tie from the other side, and I'm again approaching the beginning of the opening. So I will do exactly what I did from the other side. I will just make sure to overlap them. This way this time I'm sewing from the other side, so I'll be covering that first seam, so I'll be just sewing and peeking where do I have to sew. Again, try to sew as far as you can go. Okay, so it starts to get really uncomfortable, so I will do a few back stitches, and that's it. So now what we have this mess, and we will start pulling that bow tie through this left opening, okay? Yeah, don't forget to trim the corners on this side of the bow tie as well. So I will go ahead and start just pulling that bow tie through. So when you pulled through both pieces, so the opening looks like this, right? And here we can see how beautiful it looks. So now we only have to cover this opening at the neckline, right? So here, because we were not able to reach from the bow tie all the way through. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to fold this seam allowance 1 centimeter, and I will go ahead and base stitch to cover this spot, and I will finish with the hand stitch. So when I have the seam base stitch and covered, I will just go ahead and do a few hand stitches to cover that place. So here I'm taking 1 thread at the facing. I will go here to the bow and just push fabric like this, and I will just pull it a little bit, and here again I take 1 thread on the facing and then back to the bow, and I will continue doing this until I fully close that opening, and then I will remove the base stitch. Give your dress a final press, and this is the result you get. This dress is fabulous for the summer season because it's just so breezy, and when made from linen fabric, it's just amazing for summer. The pattern is linked in the description box. Thank you for watching today's video. If you enjoyed it, I would appreciate if you would hit the like button. Thank you, and I will see you next time. Bye!